Hello everyone. I'm sorry about those technical difficulties. We are on a new link now, and hopefully that'll work for everyone. And we did send out an email with the new link to everyone who registered. It's posted on our social media, so if you can share that with other folks. We're gonna go ahead and try this again right now. Thank you for bearing with us. Again, I apologize. But yeah, welcome in everyone. Thank you for joining us for Who Has Access? Water and Life Along the Colorado River. This program is an Arizona Humanities Climate Conversations program. Arizona Humanities is a state chapter of the National Endowment for the Humanities. We support humanities-based public programs throughout Arizona in partnership with cultural and educational organizations. This program is funded in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we will be dropping a link in the chat for you to ask questions. But if you do have a Google account, you can go ahead and join the chat. And if you have any questions for Cora tonight, please put them in the chat. And again, I apologize for any technical difficulties. And I'd like to reintroduce our speaker as well if you weren't able to hear it the first time. We're really excited to have Cora Tso here again. She is a Western Lands attorney at Western Resource Advocates. As an environmental law and policy expert, she works to preserve natural landscapes, promote outdoor equity, and ensure sustainable access to public lands and waters in the West. Previously, she served as an attorney candidate in the Water Rights Unit at the Navajo Nation Department of Justice, where she helped to secure and protect the nation's water rights claims across Arizona, Utah, and New Mexico. Tso is an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. She is of the Reed people and born for the Blackstreak Wood Clan. Her maternal grandparents are of the Bitterwater Clan, and her paternal grandparents are of the Red House Clan. She was born and raised on the Navajo Reservation and is originally from Shanto, Arizona. So again, ladies and gentlemen, we welcome Cora Tso tonight. Yeah. So as before, my first question for you is if you can talk to us about your current role at Western Resource Advocates.
Yeah, happy to. And hello, everyone. So currently I work for Western Resource Advocates. We are an environmental nonprofit organization that covers the Intermountain West. And I am the staff attorney for the Western Lands program. We have 3 programs within WRA that cover healthy rivers, clean energy, and Western land conservation. And so on the team, I support the entire policy initiatives of the Western Lands program, in addition to some policy development here within the state of Arizona that aims to increase access to the outdoors for underrepresented youth and their families across the state. So I'm really excited to be expanding my environmental practice into WRA. I previously worked for the Navajo Nation Department of Justice in the Water Rights Unit, doing primarily tribal water law for the nation, in addition to other tribal legal matters that were required in that role. And that is primarily the work that I do as an attorney. I'm very passionate about environmental issues and saw that it was only fitting to continue my environmental practice by learning about land policy and land management when we talk about water resource development and management.
Wonderful. And can you tell us a little bit about growing up on the Navajo Reservation and how that kind of influenced your path to environmental law and policy?
Yeah, definitely. I think like many people, I spent a lot of time outside as a kid, and some of my favorite memories are going to Lake Powell with my family in the summer, and just being around water was always a great time for me. Whenever it would rain, there was a natural pond structure nearby our houses growing up, and so my siblings and I would always go there and try and catch tadpoles. And so just whenever I was around water, it was always exciting. And also growing up in a traditionally Navajo home, understanding the cultural importance of water and how we pray with it and use it in ceremony is super important. So having that reverence for the resource as well was instilled in me at a young age. And so understanding that sacredness of it, but also the developing interest in how we can adapt with the water and recreate with the water was also an important part of my childhood too. And it wasn't until I came down to ASU for school that I really noticed many folks may not have access to the outdoors like that. And also when I learned more about the environment and natural resource development within the West, understanding that Arizona is a very dry state, and more often than not, people don't have access to water in the same way that I did growing up.
Right. It's really great to hear kind of your personal connection to thinking about the environment, and it's something you grew up with. So I can really see how that influenced your path into environmental law. Are there any defining memories or experiences specifically that kind of confirm that this is what you want to do, especially kind of going into the legal field? I know you talked about kind of your experience with Lake Powell, but is there any kind of defining moment either in your childhood or even at ASU?
Yeah, when I think back to why I wanted to become a lawyer, I think back to taking Navajo government and language classes in high school and learning about the Navajo Nation's history and relationship with the federal government, and learning about the long walk, learning about how our tribal council was developed and how that had a role with oil and gas development. And as a product of going to school off the reservation in Page, driving by the Navajo generating station every day was really informative. Yeah. And seeing the complexity between tribal economic development, seeing the economic development for the city of Page, and a lot of my friends' families relying on that coal-powered fire plant, but seeing it so close to the water, seeing it so close to the Colorado River, made me think about how we protect that water resource, but also how we balance the need for economic development. And so all of that, once I learned more about the details of the progress of that generating station and how water is used there in Glen Canyon Dam to generate electricity, was just super fascinating to me. And so I knew when I learned that I wanted to help advocate for my community in negotiations like that, and in places where tribal voices aren't really represented. And so making sure that communities also, Navajo communities also prosper from natural resource extraction like that was super important. And learned that many people become attorneys or go into policy to work in spaces like that. And being first generation, I didn't have too many models to look to go into that career. And so I read a lot of biographies and memoirs, and understood that a lot of people went to law school. And so that was just kind of the path that I was following. But it wasn't until I went to undergrad at ASU and taking American Indian Study classes and learning about the history of the federal government and federal Indian policy, federal Indian law, and how there are so many legal policies that really try to extract tribal sovereignty and tribal power, and seeing all of those connections to how tribal nations live today was really empowering, and was really traumatizing too, to go to school and to learn all of that, and to know that, and have the choice to not do anything about it was just not an option for me. And so those are kind of some of the defining moments that I think back to when I think about why I wanted to do this work.
Thank you so much for sharing that. The work you do is so important, and it is really important that there is representation. So we love that you are just a community builder, if you will, a community leader. I love that you are reading biographies to kind of understand what you could do in your role. That's really amazing, and hopefully you can inspire future children to think about the legal field too, because I know we need more of you. Yeah,
definitely. Hopefully.
So I kind of want to dive into a little bit of our topic today now. So, we have done some programs on water in Arizona, and we know that water rights can be very complicated. So I'm wondering if you can kind of talk us through some of the historical policies or events that have shaped where we are with our current water laws, especially thinking about tribal water rights in Arizona and kind of the Southwest region, kind of thinking about the relationship of that with states and their fight over the water. I know we're reading so much in the news now about states competing for water access, but I really want to hear about like where do the tribes' rights kind of come into that conversation?
Yeah, definitely. First and foremost, water law is super complex, and when we talk about tribal water law, we're adding another layer of legal history and policy to that mix. And there are so few attorneys who grew up with the land and on spaces where our tribal governments exist as a product of maybe the federal government assimilating us into cities, and so there's so much complexity in this work. And I just wanted to preface that because sometimes it's hard to articulate the nuances of tribal water law, but it's important to understand that when we're talking about tribes' access to water and tribal water rights, it's inherent to each tribe. And within the Colorado River Basin, we have 30 sovereign nations who have different cultural ties to the land and to the water and have a unique way of how they've managed it and how they use it within their own communities. And so tribes have always been here sustaining their communities and sustaining their livelihoods and living among each other and figuring out how to adapt to the change of climate throughout history. But it wasn't until the late 1800s and early 1900s where we really had beginning legal conflicts of water because there was so much development out west and in response to the gold rush in California. It's my understanding that the 1922 Colorado River Compact was a product of folks from different states in our basin who were worried that California was going to take all of our water because we are based on a water system, a legal system that prioritizes a first in time, first in right structure. So the person who can put the water to use at beneficial use and can show that they have used the water in that way and can prove the date that they use the water in that way has that priority. So when we think about water law in the West, because of scarcity, we do have to have that priority system to allocate water rights to people. And so, as I mentioned, the 1922 Colorado River Compact was an interstate negotiation between the 7 Colorado Basin states, and that was in partnership with the federal government of allocating water resources to the 7 states and allocated the structure of the upper basin states and the lower basin states. Arizona is a part of the lower basin. And you can imagine that these negotiations were happening down the road from tribal nations and tribal governments. And it is one of the inequities of the legal system that tribes were not did not consent to those negotiations, were not a part of those negotiations, but that is the law of the river right now. And tribes have always been fighting for a seat at the table, have always been fighting to be a part of those allocations, because now we're in a place where the states are continuing to fight over water resources and continuing to develop while tribes are trying to work with whatever legal mechanism they can.
Yeah.
And I think we'll get to that later in the conversation, but I definitely want people to understand that tribes have always been advocating for our water. And it has been, I think, a struggle, but also it's a lot of inequity. And you think about all of these policies being created without representation, but it's also important to put this in context of tribal histories. And so when we think about tribal nations within the basin and throughout Indian country, we weren't even considered citizens by the United States when this compact was being negotiated. We were granted citizenship in 1924, and so to think about that why we weren't included, I think it's pretty safe to say that they didn't want us included. And so it's been interesting to learn about that history, and it's been interesting to also try and work with other advocates to figure out how we not only continue that fight, but also move forward in progress and in partnership, and ultimately get our communities access to water.
Absolutely. Thank you for kind of really providing that context. And I definitely understand that we're talking about water, but there's so much more history behind this. And tribes have not been part of that conversation when these decisions have been made, and that's really important to note. So thank you for saying that. And you also mentioned there are a lot of different tribal, there's a lot of different access to water policies for different tribes. Sorry if that makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about how different tribal communities have resolved their water rights? I know not all tribal communities have resolved water rights, but some do and some are unresolved. Is there a case that may be a good example of where there has been a good resolution that's beneficial to everyone, or are we looking at mostly cases where they're really just not ideal and not something that should serve as a model?
I think the entire system should not serve as a model, and that's my personal opinion. And I think oftentimes there really aren't too many cases that are beneficial to tribes. Tribes have had to fight in foreign courts for rights to water that we have used for a millennia, and learning how to advocate in those spaces, learning how to code switch and advocate for our people is a battle in itself. But I do want to highlight Arizona v. California, and that is a case that went up to the Supreme Court in the mid-1900s and really established the priority of states' water rights in the basin, namely Arizona and California, as the case entails, the case name entails. But 5 Colorado River tribes were allocated their water rights in that case, and it's super interesting to see the federal government honor those treaty obligations, and it begs the question of why aren't the rest of the tribes and within the basin, the other 25, not included in that. And there, of course, is so much scholarship and information about why that is. But that serves as a model, especially for other tribes who want to adjudicate their water rights, because first and foremost, it shows that, yes, we do have valid rights to this water. Yes, we do have advocates at the table ready to negotiate fairly and bring access to people who need water. And 2, it shows that, and 3, what's really interesting about that case is that there is a tribe that wasn't abutting the river. And so that's super important, because when we look to the most recent Supreme Court case regarding the Navajo Nation's water rights, one of the arguments was that the Navajo Nation's original reservation didn't touch the Colorado River. And so to think about these different strings of arguments saying that this reservation doesn't touch the water, so how could they have used it? And they're so far away from the river. We have precedent in cases like Arizona v. California that shows that argument does not matter. And so there's little strings of silver linings in the legal history, but there aren't too many.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think it is important to understand that even though some water rights have been resolved for certain tribal communities, it's not something that's really beneficial for all parties. So I thank you for mentioning that. And then we mentioned the Supreme Court case, and that's something that we really want to dive into, is looking specifically at the Navajo Nation and their access to water. So this summer we had that that case, Arizona v. Navajo Nation, about their water rights. Can you talk a little bit more about the background of that case and some of the historical context kind of leading up to it and that decision?
Yeah, definitely. For the case to get to the level that it did, there, of course, is years of legal precedent and history going up through the federal court system, starting here in Arizona, going to the Court of Appeals in the Ninth Circuit, and then being appealed to the Supreme Court. And along the way, courts have either sided with the United States and other states, and the Ninth Circuit actually sided with the Navajo Nation and affirmed our claims that the United States does have an affirmative trust duty to help us access our water, and that may mean, identifying what water resources we have in the main stem Colorado River, and also too, figuring out how we access that water. And so as a trustee, as a legal fiduciary to the Navajo Nation through our treaty rights, the federal government does have that responsibility, and they have that responsibility to every tribe they've created a legal relationship with and created legal and political promises with. And so this case is the Navajo Nation asking for the federal government to hold up their end of the bargain, because we knew when we were negotiating our 1868 treaty, that was in the context of confinement and forced relocation to Fort Sumner in New Mexico. And I'm sure many folks understand what the Long Walk was, but our treaty was negotiated there, and our people knew that we wanted to go home. We knew we wanted to go home because we had cultivated the land, we knew where the water was, we knew that our communities thrived, and that was where the holy people placed us, that was where the Creator placed us, and we knew we wanted to go home. There was definitely people who wanted us to relocate to other reservations, like other tribes had, and so it was not for, I guess it wasn't just decided that we returned to our home. We advocated for that because we knew that our home provided a safe space for us, and it's where we had lived for generations. And so to think about how we negotiated our treaty at that time is super important, and I think the dissent from Justice Gorsuch highlights the advocacy that our tribal leaders had at the time, because this case too talked a lot about treaty interpretation and what we meant when we were negotiating for our return to our homelands. But I think it begs a larger question of how we as a society uphold those treaty rights to tribal nations, because many treaties were made in the promise in cession of our lands that everybody resides on now, for the promise of a permanent homeland, for our sustainment as a people and as the original caretakers of this land. And so it's just important to recognize that this treaty meant so much to our people, but it also was a very intentional and intelligent thought process that went into asking for us to go home in the way that we did. Yeah, that's that's the context I would really love to share, because I think it's super important when we talk about whether the federal government even owes us a duty to help us secure our water to the Colorado River. And I struggle so much with the legality of it, because it's hard to understand the legal history and the political history of this country, and be in DC and argue that the federal government doesn't have a responsibility to help us secure our water. And even taking out the tribal nation and tribal sovereignty part of the conversation, Arizona citizens in northeastern Arizona don't have access to running water, don't have access to potable water to sustain their communities, to stay healthy. And it's a larger conversation than tribal rights. It's human rights, and I feel like that's something that's often left out of the question or conversation. And I hope that we can move forward and have these brave conversations. So I'm really appreciating you inviting me to talk about this, because it's super important and timely.
Thank you so much for sharing that important context around the case. And you're right, access to water is a human right. And I know that a large percentage of people on the Navajo Nation don't have access to clean and safe water. Can you talk a little bit more about, like, after this Supreme Court decision, like, do you know what, like, the next steps are to securing water access?
Yeah, I think the fight continues. We have so many brilliant Navajo attorneys who are working tirelessly. We not only have to advocate for our water rights in Arizona, but in New Mexico and Utah, and manage in a tri-state area. But also we have to work in partnership with states and other tribal nations, as climate change is forcing us to partner and forcing us to figure out these big solutions to the management of the river and the over-allocation of water resources. And I think for the nation, and I think for a lot of tribal nations, when we have a case that goes up to the Supreme Court, everybody is nervous, because what happens there affects almost everybody in Indian country. And so it was such an amazing experience to see a lot of tribal nations submit briefs in support, and other organizations and submit their briefs in support as well. And I think having conversations like this to just talk about the reality of what water access looks like for the Navajo Nation is super important to that advocacy, because at the end of the day, these are laws and policies that we as citizens of this country have a say in. And I think it's important to recognize that power of being able to use your voice and talk to those who make these decisions.
So important. Thank you. I just want to know, what's happening next and what we can do to support that. And you mentioned climate change, which is kind of getting to our next question is, climate change, as we all know, is just worsening conditions right now on the Colorado River and everywhere, and it just makes water a scarcer resource. So can you talk a little bit about how climate change is really exacerbating that inequity in water access for communities across the Southwest?
Yeah, definitely. We're in a time where we are in a severe drought. We have hotter summers and wetter winters. And by a product of that, that affects not only people in communities who rely on seasonal surety of when our resources are coming down from the Rocky Mountains, and understanding how we navigate our lifestyle around that. There's so many effects of how climate change is furthering the inequities that exist. People who are in the upper basin, the Navajo Nation among them, and other tribal nations who are forced to leave their water in upper basin reservoirs are inherently conserving water, and not by choice, but because the legal system cannot grant them access to their own water. And so when you think about that in the context of how state and federal parties are negotiating to bring more water down from the upper basin reservoirs to Lake Powell, to Lake Mead, to sustain the lower basin, it creates more inequities, because that water that is being forcibly conserved up there to the benefit of all of us down here is inherently wrong, in my opinion, because communities need that water in the upper basin as well. And I think that when we think about inequity, if we are not being thoughtful in creating conversations that represent all voices and all people who have valid claims to the river and its resources, I think we're going to continue to exacerbate that legal regime that is just not fair and it's unjust, and continue to perpetuate this problem that we are being forced to try and wrangle with now. I think when I think about the Navajo Nation in particular, climate change and the scarcity of water, if we don't have surface water, we're forced to look to other water resources like groundwater or seasonal precipitation and conserving water in that way. But it's important to recognize that while we do have other water resources on the nation, that doesn't mean that that water is potable. That doesn't mean that that water has good quality and that we can easily access that. Right. So it's super important to think about how when we lose one resource, that definitely supply and demand forces us to look to our other supply, and sometimes that isn't even an option. And so we hope that with developing technology and continued partnerships, we can hopefully solve issues like that, but it definitely does make the work a lot harder.
Absolutely. I think you're so right that climate change is really affecting those frontline communities, the most underserved communities, and it's something that we should all be thinking about. Thank you for sharing that. And that kind of goes into our next question, that you're an advocate for environmental equity. What does that mean to you? What does environmental equity look like?
I think that it's important to recognize the difference between equality and equity. When we think about equity, in my personal definition, it means that everybody has a equal and fair chance at the piece of the pie. And so when we think about environmental equity, it's a community and it's a society that premises the fact that each individual has that fair allocation, that fair exposure, and that fair experience with our natural resources to benefit and to also live a healthy lifestyle. And I think that when we think about environmental work, it's not just about conservation of public lands or sustaining ecosystems and wildlife. It's also about making sure that everyday citizens have quality access to water, to energy, and to make sure that we are adapting to climate change in a way that is sustainable for everybody. As you mentioned, disadvantaged communities often suffer climate change at a disproportional rate in comparison to other communities. And so when we think about environmental equity, for me, that means putting those communities first. It means putting those communities in the conversation, and I think guiding our policies from their needs and doing an honest assessment of what that looks like. And sometimes that might be hard, but I feel like that is what is needed, and I think what is right.
That's a beautiful definition of it. And we talk about equity a lot in all different types of topics here at Arizona Humanities. And I feel like we don't really think as much, I should say, about environmental equity. And so I'm glad that you mentioned it's access to water, but also thinking of access to energy. I'm kind of thinking here in Phoenix, and this summer it was just so hot, and certain communities are just more affected by that heat if they don't have access to electricity or air conditioning, things like that. And I know we can talk about air pollution and just where certain communities are built too. Some of them are built on basically like hazardous waste zones, and how does that get exacerbated again by climate change? So I think definitely when we think about environmental equity, we have to be thinking about the inequities that exist right now, and then how can we make a more equitable outcome. And I just really am thinking back to what you said about water access being that human right, so really kind of thinking about that. And I'm glad we're having this conversation too, because I think it's good to have these discussions about what access looks like for different communities, because I know here in Phoenix it's very easy to just turn the water on and we don't think about where that water comes from. and what communities don't have access to that kind of what we do here. So thank you so much for sharing that. Can we talk a little bit about how we can encourage more conversations like this about diversity and equity when we talk about environmental policy?
Yeah, definitely. I think first and foremost, it is looking at the room and looking at who's not included in that conversation. Whether that's geographically, socioeconomically, racially, and also by age, understanding that the impact to the older generation is going to be a lot different than the impact to our generation, and understanding that the diversity of thought, the diversity of perspective is not only going to lead to better outcomes because we have a more diverse, well-rounded perspective and dialogue, but it also too is preventing further problems down the line when we didn't include people. We're thinking about the Colorado River now, and so many folks in the basin are wondering if tribes are given their water rights and their rights are adjudicated. Does that take from my water? Does that take from my family who farms down in Yuma? Does that take from my family in Nevada who lives in the city? I think it's important to recognize the lessons that we've learned in this short course of history, and making sure that we include voices that were left out, but also making sure that we go beyond that, and making sure that it's a whole well-rounded conversation, because I feel like we've learned so much, and it's hard to think that we won't act accordingly and do better. But I really think it's important from a public policy standpoint to understand that there's just the smart decision. When we think about how people learn and how they approach different problems, there's so many different solutions that I would come up with versus how you would come up with a problem. And I think it's just an intelligent way of moving forward, of including everyone.
Absolutely. Having different voices in the room, so important. Thank you. And our audience is always kind of wondering, what can the average person at home do to promote environmental equity?
Yeah, definitely. I think first it's taking pause and understanding the problem, and that might mean educating yourself of having conversations like this, but also to looking at resources that you have. I think technology is such an important resource for us. I continue to learn daily, listening to podcasts and sometimes being on TikTok, but just making sure that I am continually educating myself is important. And I think people would naturally gravitate toward wanting to understand the problem and wanting to be sure that the news that they're hearing, the resources that they are taking in are accurate. And so I think that's first and foremost the first step. But two, oftentimes it's hard to think about how we as individuals can help folks who don't have access to water. It was such an amazing experience to see how many people supported the Navajo Nation when we were in COVID, and still are in COVID, but how the Navajo Nation was disproportionately impacted, and seeing people send water up to the tribe was super, it was just super exciting to see that people could come together like that. And so it's little moments like that, but it's also understanding that we have so much power in our voice, and hopefully, better access to technology and engagement within our politics. I think that as an individual myself, I hope that I contribute to the dialogue by having conversations with the people who I admire. So oftentimes I've tried to look for mentors, even if that person may or may not support the adjudication of tribal water rights. Learning from their perspective and understanding where we could come to the table and meet in the middle is super important. And I too wanted to also recognize that we each have different attributes to give. And so when I was thinking about some of the work that I did up at the Nation and how people always say, there's money there, there's resources here, why doesn't the tribe access this? It really made me think that, there are so many ways that communities could help each other by not only showing up at the legislature and helping advocate for a certain policy that helps, or even, donating your time to grant writing and creating more applications, like just simple things like that. I think people may be challenged to think out of the box, but I hope that we look at different solutions to that, because individually we have so much to give and so much to help with.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I know, I'm always curious about what can we do to help. I think tuning into this conversation is important, but what else can we do besides that? So that kind of wraps up my questions for you, and I'd love to invite our audience, for those of you who made it to the new link, if you have any questions, please add them to the chat or the Google form. I'm going to turn to Maya. Do we have any questions from our audience?
Hello? Can you read? All right, cool. All right, so Mary has a question. Are the Dene people working with other Arizona tribal nations as a coalition to help fight systemic racism and water sovereignty?
Oh, big
yes,
question.
yeah, definitely. I think what has been the most beautiful experience in my limited representation of the Nation as an attorney was seeing how much partnership the Nation has advocated for and sustained throughout the basin. There is an incredible organization called the 10 Tribes Partnership that really informs a dialogue about the basin management, and that is a very powerful partnership. But there's also organizations here locally like the Intertribal Council of Arizona, which represents 21 tribal nations within Arizona, and so having water conversations like that is super important. And there's also tribal representation on the Arizona Governor's Water Policy Council, and so that includes, I believe, 5 tribes, and so looking in that intertribal partnership is super important. And so those are some of the examples that tribes have looked to, and the Navajo Nation participates in partnership with other tribal nations.
Do you have any advice or affirmation for young people that want to follow your path?
Any advice? I definitely would say that making space for other opportunities. I think something that I'm really exploring right now and intentional about is letting opportunities come and being open to different opportunities. I definitely knew what I wanted to do with my career and held on to that. But there's also so much experience and knowledge in branching out and having different dialogues. Something that keeps me going is also to having that close-knit network of friends who understand the legal geeky side, but also people who understand me from back home and who are just supportive all around. I think that's so important to have that balance of being able to scratch that itch about talking about tribal water policy or tribal law, and having those different groups of friends.
That's great advice, to surround yourself with a supportive community, for sure. Great. Well, I think we have a few more minutes, so if you do have any more questions for Cora, please drop them in the chat. So I'm wondering, are there any, we talked about steps that we can take to kind of further environmental equity. Do you have any recommendations for books, or like you said, even TikToks, or videos where people can kind of learn more about the issues?
Yeah, there's definitely some super good resources, and I think I like to compartmentalize them. There's definitely a great resource that I always look to is Turtle Talk for Indian law related news and development, but also to something that I follow a lot and I think is super informative in monitoring and digesting the different activities of the basin management from the federal and state perspective is a TikToker named Western Water Girl. And she talks about water policy and development, and so I appreciate her so much for keeping up with all of that news and creating videos. There has not been a resource that I've looked to for tribal policy, or tribal water policy exactly, but I definitely try to just Google and search and stay informed. But I will say that I think any tribal water attorney or any water attorney who you can locate at firms or at organizations, I will say that I think if anybody asked them to talk more about water, that they would. And so I would definitely encourage cold calling or cold emailing people, because I definitely love to talk about it, and I can imagine, you know, my colleagues always being available to me, and I'm sure they would be available to others as well.
That's great. And I have one last question for you. You're starting out in your career now, even though you've done so much already. Kind of, where do you see yourself going in the future? I think our audience might be interested too in following you and what you hope to do. But do you have any kind of like long-term goals for what you want to do for your nation and your community?
Yeah, definitely. I've always been one of the weird ones that had wanted to run for office. So I definitely would love to do that at some point in my life, whether that's here at the state level or back home within our tribal council or tribal government. That's super important to me to have that experience. But I also do want to create safe spaces to talk about this work. In my experience, I haven't seen a dedicated space for tribal water policy. You know, I've seen spaces for environmental policy or tribal policy, or even like land policy, tribal land policy, but there's never been a specific space for this. And I would really love to create something that allows for that dialogue to happen, but also innovates and pushes the fold in research and analysis and in advocacy. And I don't know what that looks like, but I would definitely love to create something like that in the future.
That's wonderful. And I know Arizona Humanities, me included, will be following what you do. And
Thank you.
I want to thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you for everyone for sticking around. Recording will be posted later, so you can see the whole thing if you joined a little bit later. Thank you so much, Cora, for being here tonight. All right. Have a good night, everyone.